Hey, what is up, guys? I am back, and I'm very sorry for the 3-week hiatus that I've been on. I've had some major and debilitating changes in my personal life, so please do not ask about the change of scenery. It's going to change again next time. Do not ask about anything whatsoever other than the global labor arbitrage, which I know y'all have burning questions about. So I know that the global labor arbitrage sounds like ridiculous jargon, so really I'm just talking about the fact that the entire third world, almost, has been recreated or intentionally produced as the sweatshops for the West. So the fact that manufacturing, which is largely controlled by the wealthy companies in the global north, has increasingly shifted production to places where they can extract resources and exploit labor in the cheapest way possible, leading to this gross global imbalance where the third world is kept in the marginal and underclass state, and the fruit of their labor, as well as the lion's share of the profits, are enjoyed by the wealthy developed countries. So today we're going to bear witness, in a sense, to what's going on in the third world and look at exactly why this is happening. So I'm gonna link some documentaries or exposés or whatever down below, or you can just kind of Google things to check it out to really bear witness to that. But we're gonna look at the processes behind what's going on and then take a look at some examples of just how bad things are, which is just unthinkable. So any good discussion of political economic relations has to acknowledge the brutal, violent, and wildly exploitative colonial system. Despite what the trad life, trad wife movement would tell you, no, European nations did not build all of their wealth and Western civilization because they had just better family values and traditions. Not saying that they had zero ingenuity or that they didn't work hard, but literally none of this, and by this I mean the glory of Western civilization, would have been possible without the brutal repression, genocide, theft, pillage, forced slavery, etc., of the colonial projects. People across Africa and Asia had their livelihoods and social relations completely disrupted. They were no longer allowed to grow food for themselves or practice any kinds of alternative political economies, but they were forced to grow cash crops for colonial masters. They basically provided ultra-cheap labor to the parent countries that were simultaneously stealing all of their natural resources. Because all of this wealth flowed in one direction, the wealthy Western companies were able to increase their size and their power and their global reach. So even after independence for many of these colonies, colonialism continued in a legal, sanctioned economic way. Neocolonialism refers to the ways that these hierarchies are maintained as wealthy companies from the West continue to be active in former colonies, where they buy up land, they buy up resources with their enormous wealth and power that they developed through colonialism, and people from these countries continue to provide cheap labor to produce them. So the triad countries of the US, the EU, and Japan continue to reap the economic benefits of doing this. What allows them to continue this exploitation, you say? Well, I've mentioned neoliberalization in many of my past videos, but basically world free trade and the deregulation of trade barriers have largely contributed to this complete domination and leeching of wealth and resources from the third world. The main crux of the point is that free trade, or these deregulation of trade barriers, allows for the free movement of capital, but not labor. I'm going to repeat that again because it's very important. Capital is free to move wherever, labor is not. So why is this important? Well, if people cannot move, then they must stay and endure these terrible working conditions just so that they can buy food. Because in this capitalist system, we have to earn the right to eat food. And even working 16 hours a day will not guarantee that you will make enough money to eat well, even a little bit, or to have adequate shelter over your head. But anyway, the fact that capital can move, and the fact that capital has, through the colonial and neocolonial eras, been largely concentrated in the hands of the wealthy Western companies, multinational companies, they call all the shots. They have all the money, they have all the technology, they are in control of all of the commodity networks, they're in control of the transportation networks, so they can use all of that wealth and power to buy up lands and resources in these countries, or to offer contracts to people to do the work for them for the cheapest price possible. And why do they want the cheapest price possible? Profits! The same reason that any company does anything in this capitalist system. So if you have these major transnational corporations in competition with one another, then they will all be forced to adopt the same horrible practices to stay competitive and to maintain control of their market share. Consequently, workers increasingly feel the crunch of worldwide job and wage competition, and giant capital enjoys widening profit margins as the world races to the bottom in wages and working conditions. And even more insidiously, because capital can move and labor can't, if labor starts to organize and starts to strike and starts to demand better wages and better working conditions, well, capital can just take their business elsewhere to another country that'll do things for even lower prices. This also hurts labor in the West. So first of all, we're having most of our jobs being outsourced to these places that will do it for cheaper. But if we start to organize and demand better wages, better working conditions, etc., then guess what? Capital will take their business overseas. And it's not just manufacturing jobs, service jobs, tech jobs, all kinds of jobs are being moved elsewhere where they can be done for near slave wages. So the fact that we have faced stagnating wages and precarious, low-paying, flexible contract work here in the West is also very intimately linked with the global labor arbitrage, free trade, neoliberalization, globalization. And now we're also facing the same threats from automation. So, you want $15 per hour minimum wage just so that you can, still basically live in poverty but marginally afford to feed yourself and perhaps have some shelter over your head? Well, we'll just replace you with robots. You can see that this is a situation in which capital has all of the power and labor is increasingly disenfranchised. So let's take a look at just how awful the global labor arbitrage is for people working overseas. It's estimated that at least 40% of world trade is linked to outsourcing, and of that, subcontracting has assumed a large role. So global corporations and their affiliates frequently rely on sweatshops run by subcontractors to obtain lower unit labor costs. A well-known example is Nike, which is a hollow corporation outsourcing all of its production to subcontractors in South Korea, China, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. By using subcontractors, Nike and other major corporations can remove their direct involvement in production. This allows them to take advantage of extreme forms of labor coercion while kind of diffusing the situation from a PR perspective because, it wasn't our factory. Another example is Apple, whose iPhones and iPads are outsourced to the Taiwanese manufacturing firm Foxconn, which owns and operates factories in China. In the first 5 months of 2010, 16 workers jumped, with 12 dying from the high buildings at one of Foxconn's factories.
A tragic state of affairs, and in response, Foxconn has taken action to ensure the mental health of their employees by making them sign a pledge vowing not to kill themselves. Done and done.
Over 300,000 to 400,000 employees eat, work, and sleep under horrendous conditions in these factories. They are compelled to carry out the same rapid hand movements for long hours and for months on end, to the extent that workers find themselves twitching all night. As a symbol of their plight, they have twisted Foxconn's Chinese name so that it sounds like "run to your death." Workers here were paid the minimum monthly wage, which is 83 cents per hour. This is completely characteristic of so many of these subcontracting factories where workers are forced to live in horrendous conditions at the workplace. Some are not even allowed to go outside and exercise or anything. Not that they would have much time to do that, working 16 to 18-hour days. Sometimes working into the night to like 2 or 3 a.m. and then getting up for work in the morning. They are fed mainly gruel, so they are not eating well. They are eating basically just to marginally maintain bodily functions. They are not living well, and yet the cost of this gruel, I almost cannot say this out loud because it's so horrific. The cost of this gruel and of these terrible, terrible living conditions is subtracted from their already near slave wages. In terms of Apple, again with the iPhone, It's nearly impossible today to determine exactly where this thing was manufactured because it relies on parts from every other part of the world. So it says designed in California, assembled in China, which is true, but it tells us nothing of where the actual development of all of these parts took place. So all of the parts are made by 8 different companies, Toshiba, Samsung, Broadcom, etc., and then these are all shipped to China to Foxconn's factories for rapid assembly. Despite the massive input of Chinese labor to assemble these products, their very low pay means that their work amounts to only 3.6% of the manufacturing cost. Despite the massive advantage of producing in China, countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Cambodia are now being recognized as places that will do this for even cheaper. So the major corporations are increasing their production there, leading to another race to the bottom, divide and rule kind of a strategy. The 2013 Savar building collapse in Bangladesh was a very highly publicized disaster. An 8-story commercial building housing a number of sweatshop workers collapsed, killing 1,134 people and injuring 2,500 people. This is the deadliest accident in the garment industry. Workers in the building were employed for companies such as Walmart, Mango, Joe Fresh, and Primark. The building owners ignored the warnings that the structure was unsound and ordered workers to return the following day when the building collapsed. Why this happened relates strongly to the global labor arbitrage and global capitalism. The buyers that I just mentioned, that are all part of the fast fashion industry, have very short production deadlines, and the owners and the workers were compelled to put things out on time. The demand for cheap fast fashion also leads to minimal oversight into the safety and health regulations and really what's going on in any of these factories. It's pretty sad when people argue that if these people actually had trade unions to protect their interests and protect against management exploiting them or forcing them to do this, that they would actually be endangering their own jobs because they would raise the cost of production and thus capital might take their business elsewhere. It's a pretty sad and broken and terrible global economic system that we're living in, where people have to decide whether they want to organize and protect themselves and potentially endanger their jobs, or go to work every day in terrible conditions, endangering their very lives. I'm gonna end with a quote. Indeed, one should never forget the moral barbarism of a system that in 1992 paid Michael Jordan $20 million to market Nikes, an amount equal to the total payroll of the 4 Indonesian factories involved in the production of the shoes, with women in these factories earning only 15 cents an hour and working 11-hour days.